There are few decades as kaleidoscopic or as fascinating in its subject matter as the roaring 20s of the 20th century. It was a creative era without equal, with the rise of expressionism, flourishing nightclubs, and sexual freedom. But those cheerful excesses also had a shadowy downside. Prostitution, abuse of power, corruption, and free play for the mafia. Meanwhile, Germany's young democracy of the Weimar Republic was shaky. Political extremism was advancing, and large-scale unemployment led to degrading poverty. At the bottom of the ladder, people lived like animals, while the upper classes enjoyed drugs, sex, smuggling, blackmail, and an obsession with the occult. Meanwhile, conservative former soldiers were concocting revolutionary plots, while Nazis and communists alike were gaining popularity. It's a lot of ground to cover, but Babylon Berlin manages to encapsulate it all. And the main plot isn't even about any of those things. The series is loosely based upon the novel Der nasse Fisch by Volker Kutscher. I say loosely because a lot of details on the novel have been changed to adapt the series for television. The essence remains the same, however, including how well researched and historical the books are. It's a history lesson disguised as a crime novel, as there are many historical little details about Berlin and the Weimar Republic described throughout the story. The same goes for the series. You can clearly tell a lot of time went into researching the historical setting, from the politics to the clothing and even the aesthetics. In the first two seasons of the series, Germany's complex political history is ingeniously intertwined with an exciting plot about gold smuggling. Yet all the forces fighting for power in Berlin managed to play a part in that story. Nazis, conservatives, Russians, communists, police, politics, and the mafia. Babylon Berlin tells a history lesson that few people are really familiar with. The series takes place during the period of the Weimar Republic, the democratic regime in Germany between 1919 and 1933. It gives us a view on Germany that we very rarely see represented in the media, which is a shame because it's actually an incredibly intriguing and compelling period. Berlin, meanwhile, is a city scarred by the consequences of the First World War, but at the same time is famed for looking forward rather than back. It is a city of freedom, parties, drugs, and overt homosexuality, but at the same time of starving workers, increasing polarization, the radical left, and the reactionary right. The poor population flees to totalitarian regimes on both sides of the political spectrum, while the rich upper layer lives in its own isolated world, ignorant of the ticking time bomb that they're dancing on. When the series starts off, the year is 1929. During this time, the shadow of the First World War loomed far and wide over the defeated Germany. The country is still recovering from its defeat. The economy is crippled following the Treaty of Versailles, which had Germany paying $33 billion in reparation money, leaving Germany hanging by a thread. The consequences of the First World War goes beyond the national economy, however. It also damaged the bodies and psyches of those who survived it. Everyone seems to be struggling with demons of one kind or another, including the main character of the series, Detective Rath. After all, Babylon Berlin is more than just politics. It's romance, drama, thriller, and action all packed into one. The series' main character is the enigmatic Gereon Rath, who arrives in Berlin as a police officer from Cologne, a Catholic city very much unlike the progressive Berlin at the time. Like a fish out of the water in an unfamiliar city, Rath seeks to break a pornography ring, but gets swept into an increasingly darker plot the deeper he goes down the rabbit hole. At the same time, he's a deeply troubled and traumatized person, as he's being haunted by the ghosts of his past and suffers from PTSD following his experiences in the First World War. He's accompanied by a part-time prostitute, Charlotte Ritter, who, despite her upbringing in a destitute family, is an incredibly charming and carefree person who seeks to find a better place for herself in this great city. Rath is also accompanied by fellow police officer and partner Bruno Walter, whose police methods and personal agenda don't necessarily mesh very well with Gereon's. Even the minor characters stand out in how compelling and complex they are. No one seems to trust one another, and with good reason. Everyone has their own agenda in pursuit of their own goals and morals, which is not entirely unlike the reality of the Weimar Republic either, for that matter. There's communists standing up against the state, underhanded military deals of those who seek to clandestinely rebuild the German military, corrupt cops who seek to overthrow the government, and cops who are still trying their best to keep this sinking ship afloat. The setting of the Roaring Twenties and the city of Berlin itself are just as much the main character as Gereon Rath is, however. Despite these dire circumstances, the extravagance of the Roaring Twenties is still in full swing, which makes for an extreme contrast. It was a cultural golden age, during which social and economic issues came to be explored and debated through music, art, and literature. On the one hand, you have lavish nightclubs where the wealthy elite flock to ever-excessive lifestyles. Berlin's nightlife is as intense as it is decadent, with cinema, music, and dance rapidly gaining in popularity, while hedonistic pleasures are hardly frowned upon and even glorified. On the other hand, however, the poor are struck with starvation and homelessness and resort to excessive drug use, alcohol, and prostitution, while seeking their hope with any who can offer them a better perspective for the future, which at the time was not yet fascism, but in fact Bolshevism, with Trotskyists and Stalinists competing for the upper hand. It's a contrast that seems like it came straight out of a dystopian novel, but the way the atmosphere is depicted in Babylon Berlin is actually frightfully close to the truth. Equally realistic are some of the historical events that Babylon Berlin seeks to depict. Several real-world events are either hinted at or featured prominently, some more well-known than others, or not even taught in modern-day German schools at all. Take for example the coordinated protests that led to the most brutal police crackdown ever in Berlin on the 1st of May in 1929, the so-called Blutmai, or Bloody May, in which at least 33 civilians were killed by police bullets. This event was a significant moment in the decline of the Weimar Republic and its political stability, or the secret airbase at Lipetsk, where German fighter pilots were being trained in secret on Russian soil. This was in violation of the agreements of the Treaty of Versailles, which didn't allow the Germans to have an air force, but the Russians allowed it in order to gain knowledge from the Germans. Knowledge they likely used against the Germans in the Second World War, for that matter. Just like in the series, this illegal operation from the Bundeswehr was exposed by Die Weltbühne in 1927. Equally interesting is the history lesson some of its characters give to us. Charlotte Ritter seems to represent the prototype of the new woman who manifested in Berlin in the 1920s. These women were independent and chose their lovers themselves, possibly for a fee. Around the end of the war, women across Europe gained the right to vote. In Germany, Article 109 of the Weimar Constitution declared that men and women had the same fundamental rights and duties as citizens, including the right to vote and to hold public office. After the Nazis seized power, however, the newly acquired freedoms of the women disappeared like snow in the sun. Even the way the Berlin police is depicted is a valuable history lesson in itself, as they were renowned to have some of the most advanced forensic techniques in the late 1920s thanks to the famous Kriminalpolizeirat Ernst Gennard. Gennard purportedly owned his nickname Der Wolle Ernst, or the Buddha of Alexanderplatz, to his bulky 300-pound stature and his love for gooseberry pie, with which he also tried to appease many suspects before his interrogations. Equally famous was the central record of murder cases that Gennard had introduced. This led to a clearing rate of almost 95%, which is extremely high even compared to today. Gennard was said to have solved a total of 298 cases during his career. So not only does Babylon Berlin tell the story of Gereon Rath and the murder crimes he needs to solve, but is at the same time a compelling history lesson of the Weimar period in Germany. It shows an ailing Germany that is trying its hardest to recover from the consequences of the Great War and to rebuild itself into a prosperous nation, but at the same time is heading for a certain, inevitable disaster. Berlin itself is presented with great ingenuity, as no expense has been spared. The filming was done on large sets and on the streets of contemporary Berlin, where computer animation brought architectural highlights destroyed by the Second World War back to life. In my Generation War video, I mentioned that Generation War was the second most expensive German production at the time. You're looking at the reason why I said second most expensive. The first 2 seasons of Babylon Berlin cost a total of 40 million euros. Still a minor sum compared to some of the more well-known shows, which only further proves the impressive job this show did in order to accurately recreate Berlin. The story itself doesn't overstay its welcome. The storytelling manages to remain efficient and keep up its momentum throughout the seasons. Volker Kutscher's series of books number up to 7 so far, with 2 more expected to be released before the series officially ends. With the first 2 seasons covering the first book, one would think that there's still more than enough material to glean inspiration from for future seasons. Because of this, it may sometimes feel like character growth progresses rather slowly, but the pacing feels right nonetheless because each season brings with it its own major mystery, and all your attention will be necessary to keep up with the plot development. Even with all the plot and intrigue that's happening in the murder mystery that's afoot, however, I can't help but feel that perhaps the greatest tragedy Babylon Berlin seeks to tell us lies in its overarching narrative. How no matter how well-meaning some people's good intentions may have been, they inevitably ended up enabling the rise of a regime that later on changed more than they bargained for. Even with a democracy, a parliament, free press and a legal system, the many circumstances and systems in place were leading them all to one particular outcome. The series takes place during a time where you wonder whether the actions of the main characters will pay off and whether history might turn out differently. But in the end, you know that they are struggling against something that will inevitably win, no matter the small victories the main characters gain for the time being. It's a sad truth to an otherwise gripping and intense story. Even so, the series also shows us that the Nazis didn't just come out of nowhere either. They were people who responded to the state of the German society and acted against it accordingly. Even the right-wing nationalists that appear in the series are not inherently Nazis right away, but rather people who want to return Germany to its former glory of the Hohenzollern monarchy that fell from grace after the disastrous consequences of the First World War. The name Hitler itself is mentioned only once in all 16 episodes. The brown shirts don't make an appearance until close to the very end of season 2. Even that is historically accurate, mind you, as Berlin at the time was a bastion of left-wing politics. In the 1928 election, the Nazis only got 2.6% of the votes. It was a period where communism was still on the rise in the German capital, as it was being swarmed with emigrating Russians, like supporters of Trotsky who fled after Stalin came to power. There's a good reason why Goebbels once called Berlin the reddest city in Europe besides Moscow. And yet, despite all its grim depictions of morality, politics, lifestyles and many other extremes, it never feels like Babylon Berlin forces any sort of morale or superficial messages on the viewer. Nor does it ever feel particularly emotionally manipulative or ironic. The viewer can make what they want of all the cultural shifts and politics, with no moral judgment involved. To me, Babylon Berlin is without question the best German series I've laid eyes upon. In fact, it's one of the best series I've laid my eyes upon, period. It easily stands its ground against more well-known, high-caliber series with production budgets that eclipse Babylon Berlin's. At the end of the day, the series of course remains a historical drama, not a documentary. It is ultimately no substitute for an in-depth study of the Weimar history and culture, but it is nonetheless a great starting point and window into the wondrous world of the Roaring Twenties. I highly recommend you check it out if you have the chance. I do recommend you watch it in its original German dub if you can though. There is an English dub, but I hear it's an abomination and does a disservice to the original material. It's sort of like German dubs tend to do with English movies.
Ich bin dein Vater.
Maybe it's a payback of some kind. The series is available on Netflix in the US, Canada and Australia at the time of this review. If you live outside of those areas, there are certain ways to make the US catalog of Netflix available to you, but I don't have a partnership to advertise for any particular companies. Hit me up, VPN companies, I totally could have shilled out for you. It's also been renewed for a 4th season and a 3rd has been released earlier this year, so you can count on it that I will look into reviewing those as well. There's a lot more to discover behind the history of Babylon Berlin, as many of the characters are based on real historical figures. So if you would like to learn more about Germany or Berlin during this period, be sure to let me know. Or if you're interested in that and more, I would like to invite you to subscribe to this channel, like this video, leave a comment, hug a Trotskyist, or just do whatever makes you happy. For now, I wish you a jazzy day in this roaring 20s decade.